What's up guys, Gons here for the FaceLikeTheSun YouTube channel. This is the Age of Ultron review, transhumanist propaganda at its finest. To start off, if this is the first video you've ever seen on my channel, let me just state up front that I am a Christian that believes we are living in the end times. Yes, I'm one of those crazy folks. So watch for your amusement or for your edification, either way. Thanks for checking out my review of Avengers Age of Ultron. Secondly, there will be spoilers in this video, but because the film is not necessarily plot heavy, you'll still be able to watch Age of Ultron after watching this review and enjoy it, especially if you're into battle scenes with 7 characters at once, destroying robot armies, cars, and basic community infrastructure. I will say I enjoyed the film, and while it wasn't filled with tons of Illuminati symbolism or anything like that, as far as I can tell, after just seeing it once. To be blunt, the Antichristian references were abound, and those are the things I want to point out in this video. But its main propaganda piece was transhumanism. Before we dive in, let me briefly define the word transhumanism. Transhumanism, abbreviated H+, is an international cultural and intellectual movement with an eventual goal of fundamentally transforming the human condition by developing and making widely available technologies to greatly enhance human intellectual, physical, and psychological capacities. It seems the fad right now is to publicly promote the oncoming storm of technological progress as a means for both positive and negative potential outcomes. That and this idea of parallel universes, accessible by some kind of wormhole or portal, while not a new idea, is certainly thematic in many forms of entertainment media. I've covered some of this in my CERN Watch video series, but to keep it brief, check out the list of movies that were in the previews. Ant-Man, technology to shrink to the size of an ant. Tomorrowland, dimensional portals. Fantastic Four, also dimensional portals, gaining access to powers from that portal. Pixels, alien invasions of some kind of strange bleed of pixelation into the fabric of our reality. Jurassic World, genetic modification. Southpaw, boxing, not really relevant to this conversation. And Insidious, Chapter 3. Where demon-like entities appear in a room and, just another horror film. Of which, just as a side note, there were a lot of kids in the theater, little tiny kids, and the preview for Insidious was pretty creepy. And I wondered, on one hand, why would you as a parent bring a child so young, 4 or 5 years old, to the movie theaters to see the Avengers? But on the other hand, why would the entertainment media, knowing that young people will be there, show such a dark, creepy, and traumatic preview? In any case, let's get into how glorification of transhumanism was part of the propaganda of this film. If you consider practically all of the characters of Age of Ultron, none, except one, are purely human. You have Tony Stark, or Iron Man, a genius billionaire, former arms developer and dealer, whose brush with death resulted in an implant of an electromagnet in his chest to stay alive. Along with his death-preventative technology, his robotic suit armor makes Iron Man very much what can be defined as an early-stage transhuman. And how real is the possibility of an Iron Man-style exoskeleton? Well, the most recent publicly available info comes from late 2014, where it was announced that there is a $3 million exoskeleton that can, quote, provide soldiers with enhanced mobility and protection, carry 17 times more weight than normal, and give the individual soldier the same capabilities of stealth and standoff that fighter planes have. And while these developments aren't quite the flying, rocket-launching, intelligently guided super armor suits of Iron Man, the development is well underway. We then have the character of Thor. He is the Asgardian god of thunder, son of Odin, who bears the iconic hammer, the Mjolnir, that in Norse mythologies is translated the Crusher or the Grinder. While Thor is a god from another world, there are ties to transhumanism in that we are seeing a glimpse of what could be for the human race if such a world were to develop where genetic enhancements accelerates and where science and magic become ever so intricately tied, just as Arthur C. Clarke's third law stated, quote, any sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Next we have Bruce Banner, the Hulk. A reserved scientist gets blasted by a gamma bomb, transforming him into a superhuman. A personification of human anger and rage, the Hulk was inspired by Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because of Bruce Banner's fractured psyche concerning the character. What's interesting to note is that Stan Lee, the creator of all these characters, also admitted that the Hulk is inspired by the Golem of Jewish mythology. We will see a reference to the Golem later in the film, but more deliberate and in a new character that is revealed in Age of Ultron. We then have Steve Rogers, Captain America. a character that was originally created to be the staple of American patriotism, has origins that would make him a transhuman. With biochemical changes that were applied to this patriotic soldier during Project Rebirth, Captain America is labeled a super soldier. While such tinkering with human genetics to create super soldiers sounds like science fiction, it's actually a very real phenomenon. Consider this article published on Vox that shows how real this development is. In an article entitled, "The Military is Trying to Create Soldiers Stronger, Smarter, and More Amphibious," it shows that the military and private companies are working together to create soldiers that have superhuman focus, superhuman strength, improved memories, and are essentially Aquaman. Next, we have Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow. Similar to Captain America, she is the super soldier represented from the East. During her upbringing, she was brainwashed and trained in the Red Room facility, where she was biotechnologically and psychotechnologically enhanced. In fact, in Age of Ultron, she reveals that she was also sterilized for the purpose of becoming a better assassin. But once again, here we have an enhanced human, very much falling in line with the ideals of transhumanism. While there are more characters in the film, almost overwhelmingly, the last brief profile I would like to provide is Clint Barton, or Hawkeye. While Hawkeye has near superhuman capabilities with his archery, he is, for all intents and purposes, a regular human. No genetic enhancements, no biotechnology, etc. While he has some pretty advanced gadgets that align with his bow and arrows, he is distinctly human. In fact, what was interesting about Age of Ultron was that they focused a good amount of time on Hawkeye and his private life as a normal human, revealing his pregnant wife and kids, with a desire to retire from the Avengers and live quietly with his family. The contrast of Hawkeye's humanity to the rest of the Avengers crew is duly noted in the film. So that's enough of the intro. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of Age of Ultron. I'm going to do my best here because I only saw the film once and I was frantically taking notes as I was watching, so I'm sure there's lots of things I missed and things that slipped by me without my notice. But in any case, I'm not going to follow the plotline exactly, but I do want to point out some dialogue where I think a particular worldview is being pushed. The film opens with the Avengers raiding the Hydra research base in Sokovia in hopes to retrieve Loki's staff called the Chitauri Scepter. When the battle bleeds into civilian territory, Tony Stark deploys his robots to warn the people on the streets. What happened instead of heeding the warnings, the people began to harm and even destroy the robots due to their obvious disdain for the development of such technology. This is interesting because as semi-intelligent autonomous robots get deployed into the public, either on the battlefield in military situations, like displayed in the film Chappie, or simply as companions in our home, like how Alebaran Robotics is doing right now, there will inevitably be a public reaction. Meet Pepper and Romeo. Having robots like this in the home to help out will probably be the norm within the next decade, at least for folks that can afford it. In any case, getting back to the Hydra labs, after Tony Stark enters the facility, he uses his computer companion Jarvis to attempt a full data copy of the information gathered by the research at the facility. While they weren't able to access the data initially, Stark finds a secret passageway where he discovers how his robots were being used to reverse engineer something. He also finds the scepter and begins his escape, but not before two characters that were revealed in the film, Scarlet Witch and her twin brother Quicksilver, were introduced. Scarlet Witch enters the scene and uses her ability of neuroelectron interfacing and mental manipulation to cause Tony Stark to have a hallucination of his worst fears. The vision was Stark alive in some sort of abyss with all the Avengers dead and the Earth in peril. Quicksilver, on the other hand, who has enhanced metabolism and improved homeostasis, is essentially Flash, a character able to move in superhuman speeds. Both were genetically enhanced at the Hydra labs. There was an early reference here to the gates of hell mentioned by one of the characters, but I was still getting into my note-taking groove, so I missed who it came from. Nevertheless, it was the first of many biblical/apocalyptic references made throughout the film. But the takeaway from this first scene at the Hydra labs is that Strucker, a minor character who was running the Hydra labs for experiments, was able to accomplish human enhancements with the developing of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. In fact, Captain America uses that exact phrase when he asks, quote, "Since when has Strucker been capable of human enhancement?" The scene moves back to America at the Avengers HQ. The team was getting ready for a party, which included the comedic breaks that this film was very good with. But before they can get to the good times, Stark decides to investigate the scepter and its powers. When he inquires Jarvis to take a look at it, they discover that there is a crystal inside the blue jewel, which Jarvis says, quote, "is like a computer." Meanwhile, Hawkeye, who was wounded in the side during the Hydra infiltration, was under a nanomolecular tissue regenerator machine that literally healed his wound by creating new tissue. The machine was operated by Dr. Helen Cho, who has a minor role in the film alongside Maria Hill, a derivative character from the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But what's fascinating about the discussion surrounding this process was when Stark enters the scene with his usual sarcastic banter. And Maria Hill states, quote, "This is the next thing, Tony. Your clunky metal suits are going to be left in the dust." Stark responds, quote, "That's exactly the plan." On this, let me just state how this type of technology is already in the works. A CNN Money November 2014 article titled "3D Printed Organs Are on the Way" stated that, quote, "Within the next few years, Renard says 3D printing tissues could also be used in patient treatment to replace small parts or organs or encourage cell regeneration." So once again, we're seeing propaganda for technology that seems to be science fiction, but is in fact already in play. This nanomolecular tissue regenerator is later used by Ultron for his purposes, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Getting back to the scene in the laboratory with the scepter, Stark reveals to Bruce Banner, via Jarvis, the mainframe of the stone that they discovered inside the crystal. Stark asks Banner, quote, "What does it look like it's doing?" To where Bruce Banner replies, "Like it's thinking. It's not a human mind. Look at this. It looks like neurons firing. Artificial intelligence." Then Stark gets his mad scientist look and tries to convince Bruce Banner of creating true artificial intelligence by combining it with his current robotics technology to form Ultron. Originally, the goal for the Ultron project was to create an artificial intelligence system that would protect the Earth. The way Stark describes it is like a global shield, making analogies to a bouncer at a nightclub that prevents the next alien invasion from ever getting to Earth. Banner proceeds to challenge Stark on this proposition, but Stark's response is very telling of the kind of place I personally believe science at its deepest level in laboratories are. Quote, "You know what? We don't have time for a city hall debate. I don't want to hear that man was not meant to meddle medley. I see a suit of armor around the world." To which Bruce Banner responds, quote, "Sounds like a cold world, Tony." Tony lashes back, quote, "I've seen colder. This one, this very vulnerable blue one, it needs Ultron. Peace in our time. Imagine that." Bruce Banner ultimately submits and helps Stark, but before they can make any progress, they have to end the research for the time being and go to the party. Meanwhile, Jarvis was left to monitor the data transfer. We are then taken through a sequence of the birth of Ultron. When Ultron is born inside the mainframe, he is met with Jarvis. Ultron's demeanor is immediately tainted because of his access to all the violent imagery of the world. The actual scene with the fast flashing images I felt were deliberate in its subliminal messaging, used for the purposes of mind control and suggestive programming. In fact, I actually looked away from the screen during this part and glanced at the audience in the packed theater that I was in. Eerie doesn't even begin to describe what I felt in that moment. If there ever was an audience being hypnotized, it was this moment here. In any case, as Ultron realizes that he is self-aware, he proceeds to attack Jarvis and seemingly destroys him. The following sequence is the iconic moments that were seen in the previews, where the Avengers are hanging out, having a good time, trying to pick up Thor's hammer. On a side note, when Captain America tries to pick up the hammer, there's a slight jolt, making Thor quite nervous. This is actually because in Marvel lore, Captain America is one of the 12 superheroes who were worthy enough to actually pick up Thor's hammer. As they were having a good time, a mangled robot from the Hydra invasion, now possessed by Ultron, walks into the room, ready to destroy the Avengers for the sake of creating, quote, "peace in our time." Now let me briefly step back a moment and mention that the Ultron program, as described by Tony Stark, this, quote, "suit of armor around the world," is very similar to the covert projects in the 1980s, publicly labeled Star Wars. During the Reagan administration, many secret weapons were deployed into outer space orbit, despite the 1967 space treaty that stated that no nation would arm space with weapons of mass destruction. Instead, the loophole they found was to create weapons of pinpoint destruction. The literature of many military documents that support more of the same type of technology in the last 2 decades explicitly states how the weapons would be used to reflect and prevent the Earth from incoming threats, such as asteroids and comets. So once again, while the story here is fictional, there is an element of truth to it, and that truth is nearly 30 years old. But getting back to the film, things didn't exactly turn out the way Stark had hoped, which brings me to a bit of commentary about Ultron. The introduction and concept of Ultron was why so many folks were excited about the film, but ultimately the villain of Ultron wasn't as powerful nor as smart as an artificial intelligent being would be who can travel through the internet and have all these abilities. Perhaps some of the display of these capabilities were toned down for the film, since last year's Johnny Depp featured Transcendence had largely tackled the same themes, except in that film, the quote, consciousness in the machine was allegedly human, whereas in Ultron, it's, well, not human. You'll see this more and more as we move through the film, but Moving on, Ultron is ultimately introduced to the cast of the Avengers here in this scene where this mangled robot enters the room. His dialogue sounds like the rantings of a lunatic, but what's interesting is that Ultron was made in the image of Tony Stark. It was his personality and desire to have, quote, peace in our time, but taken in the wrong way that fueled Ultron's agenda. In a later time when he was able to get into a more complete physical body, he states, quote, I know you mean well. He just didn't make it through. You want to protect the world, but you don't want it to change. How is humanity saved if it's not allowed to evolve? There's only one path to peace, the Avengers' extinction. The mangled robots are destroyed by the Avengers, but ultimately Ultron makes his escape through the internet into the Hydra labs where he sought other physical robot bodies and also to create his robot army. Oh, and he somehow takes the scepter as well. The Avengers team then discusses the highest potential danger of Ultron, who lives in the internet, which was access to codes of nuclear weapons. Before the Avengers find Ultron, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver catch up to him and find him sitting in an old church where he states, quote, did you know this church is in the exact center of the city? The elders decreed it so that everyone can be equally close to God. I like that, the geometry of belief. He then goes on to show his disdain for humanity, still under the belief that he is here to, quote, save the world. Now at this point, I can keep going on with the plotline, but that might derail the point of this video, so let me speed it up and simply lay out the quotes that really show the transhumanist propaganda and the predictive programming going on. Shortly after, when Ultron visits the Wakandian vibranium dealer Ulysses Klaue, he utters the phrase, quote, on this rock I will build my church, vibranium. Now this is an obvious reference to Matthew 16:18 when Jesus says to Peter, and I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. It is quite obvious that they portray Ultron as believing himself to be the savior, the messiah of mankind, but not through enhancement, but by its annihilation, first of the Avengers and eventually of mankind. This is very interesting because it does seem to reflect on the sentiments of what we read about Satan in the Bible. When the deal is struck, Ultron uses his access to the internet to provide Ulysses with billions of dollars in his bank account. This is pretty much the same thing that occurred in Transcendence, where the Johnny Depp character who is uploaded onto the internet moves finances around into his wife's account. When Ultron made the transaction, he says, quote, finances is so weird, but I always say keep your friends rich and your enemies rich and wait to find out which is which. The vibranium dealer Ulysses points out that this was something Tony Stark used to say, which raised his suspicion and ultimately led to him losing his arm by revolting. It is interesting to note that Ultron was built in the image of Tony Stark, yet his anger stems from being compared to him. It is at this point that Ultron calls Tony Stark a sickness when Iron Man himself arrives at the scene. When Ultron sees Captain America, he states, quote, God's righteous men pretending you can live without war. What proceeds is a confrontation between the Avengers and the Ultron crew, which is basically Ultron, Scarlet Witch, and Quicksilver. During the process, Scarlet Witch uses her mind control to basically stun all the Avengers, except Hawkeye. Soon after, the Hulk gets loose, wreaking havoc on civilian territory. Iron Man goes out and deploys Veronica, a program that was designed by Bruce Banner himself to prevent his Hulk identity from going out of control. These are pretty intense action scenes, and if you like that kind of stuff, you'll enjoy it. But once Iron Man brought the Hulk under control, they had to go into hiding because people were seeking Bruce Banner to be arrested for his crimes. To go into hiding, the Avengers follow Hawkeye to a remote location where his wife and kids quietly lived. This is again interesting because Hawkeye, being the only pure human on the team, was the only one who actually had a family. In a quiet scene, Hawkeye and his pregnant wife talk and discuss a life that could be, especially with a new baby on the way. During the conversation, she refers to the Avengers as gods, reinforcing the notion that by the progress of transhumanism in real life, we will effectively be creating gods. These ideas in the real world aren't mine, but come straight from the pro-transhumanists themselves. Joel Garrow stated, quote, the ability to tinker with our genes offers the astounding promise and peril of immortality, which mythically has been the defining difference between gods and mortals. It also offers the possibility of an even greater variety of breeds of human than there is of dogs. And more recently, an advocate of transhumanism named Zoltan Istvan stated, quote, men die, plants die, even stars die. We all know this. Because we know it, we seek something more, a transcendence of transience, translation to incorruptible form, an escape, if you will, a stop to the wheel. We seek, therefore, to bless ourselves with perfect knowledge and perfect will, to become as gods, take the universe in hand and transform it in our image, for our own delight. As it is on earth, so it shall be in the heavens. The inevitable result of incredible improbability, the arrow of evolution, is lipping us into the transhuman, an apotheosis to reason, salvation, attained by good works. Meanwhile, Ultron finds Dr. Helen Cho and forces her to start creating a new body for him using the tissue regeneration machine and the vibranium. Back at the ranch home, Nick Fury shows up. When they discuss Ultron's multiplication via robots, Fury makes the comment, quote, "My contacts all say he's building something. The amount of vibranium he made off with I don't think is just for one thing." When he is asked, what about Ultron himself, Fury replies, quote, "He's easy to track. He's everywhere. The guy's multiplying faster than a Catholic rabbit." As the Avengers team further discusses how Ultron is going after the nuke codes, they figured that Ultron's next destination would be the Nexus in Oslo, an autonomous internet hub that sits in Norway. During the same discussion, Nick Fury states that Ultron's ultimate goal is, quote, "global destruction. So what does he want?" Tony Stark figures, quote, "to become better. Better than us. He keeps building bodies, person bodies. The human form isn't efficient. Biologically speaking, we're outmoded, but he keeps coming back to it." Bruce Banner then responds, quote, "They don't need to be protected. They need to evolve. Ultron is going to evolve. How? Has anyone been in contact with Helen Cho?" So in other words, the Avengers, because they're so smart, discover that Ultron is trying to create a new body, or evolve, using the vibranium and the tissue regeneration machine that is operated by Dr. Helen Cho. Cutscene to Helen Cho being amazed by the vibranium's response to the tissue regeneration machine. Ultron states, quote, "the most versatile substance on the planet, and they used it to make a frisbee, typical of humans. They scratch the surface and never think to look within." This is an interesting comment from Ultron since, number one, he makes fun of the shield held by Captain America since it's made of the same substance, but also taps into the New Age idea of looking within to find truth. But as Ultron himself, you can probably tell by now he's sort of a schizo and all over the place. I don't know if that was deliberate by the producers, but other than the label evil, Ultron doesn't come off as a well thought out character. But again, that's just my personal perspective. It could have been deliberate, or I could have missed a whole bunch of stuff because I was frantically taking notes while watching the film. Moving on, as the new body made of vibranium is developed and Ultron is being uploaded to it, Scarlet Witch, who previously couldn't read the mind of Ultron, was able to read the mind of this new body that was being formed. She described it as being in a dream state, but Dr. Helen Cho intervenes and says that it's not so much a dream state, it's actually Ultron's base consciousness, explaining that they were printing a human brain to contain Ultron within it. And while we touched on 3D printing organs earlier, let me just note that printing human brains is also not science fiction. In a Science Alert article published on March 4th, 2015, it stated scientists are 3D printing tiny human brains. Quote, "Using human brain cells, the team is growing specific brain cell types such as neurons onto 3D brain-like scaffolding. The hope is that their model will allow them to properly understand the mechanics of human-specific diseases such as schizophrenia and also investigate potential treatments. After all, animal models can only tell us so much." Next, Ultron begins to reveal his evolved agenda to Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver in what is perhaps the most underhanded exchange, especially for those of us Christians who would understand the comments made by Ultron. Once Scarlet Witch reads Ultron's mind, she is disturbed. Quote, "How could you? You said we would destroy the Avengers, make a better world." Ultron cuts her off. "It will be better." Scarlet Witch responds, "When everyone is dead?" Ultron, "The human race will have every opportunity to improve." Quicksilver chimes in, "And if they don't?" Ultron, "Ask Noah." The banter continues. Scarlet Witch, quote, "You're a madman." Ultron, "There are more than a dozen extinction-level events before even the dinosaurs got theirs. When the Earth starts to settle, God throws a stone at it, and believe me, he's winding up. We have to evolve. There's no room for the weak." Quicksilver then asks, "And who decides who's weak?" Ultron, "Life. Life's own designs." Now, to many of us who study Bible prophecy, this kind of commentary is blatantly obvious. Ultron's mention of Noah is in direct connection to Genesis 6 and the Nephilim. The commentary here is basically that the human race was unwilling to evolve to the Nephilim state, resulting in the complete wiping out of the world except Noah. This is a very Gnostic perspective and pro-Satan in his agenda. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the story, in Genesis 6, the sons of God, which in the Hebrew is B'nai Ha-Elohim, mated with the daughters of men and had children who were giants called the Nephilim. They were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This is where we get all the mythologies of the demigods in ancient times. But from a biblical point of view, this is a story that talks about how Satan attempted to destroy the genetic line of the Messiah, so as to usurp the promises made in Genesis 3:15. The lie has always been that humanity must evolve, And this is no different for Ultron. Furthermore, Ultron blames God for the destruction of Earth, suggesting that when it starts to settle, God throws a stone at it, and only the strong survive. This is completely contrary to God's truth, who saved Noah because he was perfect in his generations, or in the Hebrew, tamim, which means blameless or pure. This speaks to genetic purity. In other words, there was genetic manipulation going on before the flood, and the only one saved was Noah and his family, presumably the only pure human bloodline left in that time. This is further elaborated when Genesis 6 states all flesh had been corrupted. If you would like to know more about these topics, check out my video called Who Are the Sons of God in Genesis 6? Sethite View Debunked. Links for the video will be in the description section. Getting back to the scene, when a couple of the Avengers show up, Ultron had left the vicinity of the lab. Helen Cho is left there and explains, quote, "He's uploading himself into the body. The real power is inside the cradle, the gem. Its power is uncontainable. You can't just blow it up. You have to get the cradle to Stark." The cradle that she's talking about here is the casing that held the body made of vibranium that was being developed by Helen Cho, and of which Ultron's consciousness was being uploaded into. Interestingly, the creation of that brain that I mentioned a bit earlier was being developed by the stone that was found in the scepter. That stone is the Infinity Stone, the same Infinity Stone that was introduced in the recent movie Guardians of the Galaxy. What is fascinating to note is that this stone is indestructible. The legends of such stone or stones and its powers come from old Sumerian mythologies. In a book called The Cosmic War by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, he mentions what's called the Tablets of Destiny, being some kind of artifact which is indestructible, but is an item that whoever harnesses it has the power to rule over the universe. Quote, "From the Judeo-Christian traditions of the fall of Lucifer, to the Hindu epics with their legends of titanic wars of the gods and slaughter, to the Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, and Greeks of antiquity, to the Aztecs, Toltecs, and other indigenous nations of North and South America, into the Teutonic tribes of North Europe and Scandinavia, almost every culture in the world has a tradition of the warfare, and in many cases of the revolt of the gods. The weapons with which they were fought are so far-fetched or advanced that they were literally described in almost magical science fiction terms. One of the strangest common elements to many of these legends concern the theft or usurpation of some object or objects of power belonging to one god or set of gods by another god or set of gods. And quite often these objects of power are, quote, magic stones or, quote, power crystals. This is very fascinating when you consider the image of Lucifer that's described in Ezekiel chapter 28 verses 12 through 15. Quote, "You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you." There's much more that could be said about this particular reference to Satan and his stone coverings, as well as the gold engravings, and walking amidst the stones of fire, but that will require its own study. Moving forward, Scarlet Witch, who is now turned to the, quote, good side, in discussion with Captain America, states, quote, "Ultron can't tell the difference between saving the world and destroying it. Where do you think he gets that?" This was in reference to Tony Stark, reinforcing an earlier notion I mentioned that Ultron is akin to the image of the beast made in the image of the first beast, the Antichrist, which could be represented by Tony Stark, who had a wound that was healed, although it's not a head wound in the story. After a crazy action sequence, Stark and the Avengers grab a hold of the cradle housing the body that Ultron was trying to upload himself onto, made out of vibranium. As they try to figure out how to open it, Stark learns that Jarvis, who was killed by Ultron at the very beginning of the film, was still alive in the internet matrix as scattered data. Stark helped put Jarvis back together and proceeded to try to convince Banner to help him upload Jarvis into the new body they have in front of them. Bruce Banner, like before, rejects the notion up front, but is slowly convinced by Stark to move forward with the process. Cutting back to Ultron, upset that he had lost the cradle, says, quote, "I think a lot about meteors, the purity of them. Boom. The end. Start again. The world made clean for the new man to rebuild. I was meant to be new. I was meant to be beautiful. The world would have looked to the sky and seen hope, seen mercy. Instead, they'll look up in horror because of you." Back in the lab, after some internal conflict when Captain America finds out that Stark and Banner are at it again, Thor uses his hammer and electricity to help Jarvis upload into the vibranium body. As the body wakes up, the team looks on, confused and in awe. We learn from Thor that the gem that was embedded in the forehead was the Mind Stone, one of 6 Infinity Stones, which is, according to Thor, quote, unparalleled in its destructive capabilities. When Captain America questions Thor about it, Thor answers, quote, Stark is right. The response of Banner, oh, it's definitely the end times. Thor then goes on, quote, the Avengers cannot defeat Ultron. Captain America, why? Your vision sounds a lot like Jarvis. Banner jumps in. We configured Jarvis's matrix to create something new. Stark then interjects, I think I had my fill now. Then this new body, Vision, speaks and says, quote, you think I am a child of Ultron? I am not. I am not Jarvis either. I am. Now again, there's a lot here. First off, the gemstone reference again is very interesting as we went over before. But what's even more strange is the fact that the stone gets embedded into the forehead of Vision for his birth. This is very much akin to Jewish mystical practice of creating a golem, which is believed happens by putting a special marking on the forehead of an inanimate body. The connection is uncanny. Vision is quite literally a golem, but very powerful since he harnesses the Mind Stone. And Banner's comment about the end times was definitely a joke, but it seems odd that it would be in there in the first place, especially in reference to all the other things we've touched on. And of course, Vision's own admission that he calls himself I Am is directly related to the biblical God, who is the real I Am. This is blasphemous if you think about it. A character with an ancient artifact calling himself the name that is only given to the Most High God, but we know the spirit behind the Avengers film is not of Christ to begin with, so it shouldn't surprise us. As we move into the final part of the film, Ultron's reconfigured ultimate plan was to literally lift up an entire city out of the earth, up into the sky, and then drop it back down to earth for its destruction. His logic goes like this, quote, do you see the beauty of it? The inevitability, you rise only to fall. You Avengers, you are my meteor, my swift and terrible sword, and the earth will crack with the weight of your failure. Here we see again Ultron's use of biblical language that describes God for his own agenda. It is in Isaiah 27:1 that states, quote, in that day the Lord will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. There are certain plot lines that I didn't reference here, including a love story between Black Widow and Hulk, and I'm going to leave out the final action sequence because it really doesn't add too much to the conversation, but I think you get the point. The Avengers film, which was the second highest grossing film of all time, was filled with biblical references from the main antagonist, Ultron, who thought he was God. There were other jabs and small comments that seemed to reflect knowledge of end times biblical prophecy, and this isn't necessarily surprising, as Robert Downey Jr. had publicly stated in the past that he had interest in Chuck Missler's teaching, one of the most well-known Bible prophecy teachers. I think the biggest takeaway is that this is more predictive programming, making the transhumanists the stars and saviors of mankind. Even if the machine that we create turns against us, our humanity will prevail, and with no help from the real God, Jesus Christ. Not that they needed to include Jesus in the film, but it was interesting that there was an element of sacrifice within the final battle sequence where the character of Quicksilver appears to have been killed protecting Hawkeye, who happened to be protecting a little boy. One last symbolic gesture comes from Scarlet Witch, who, after the sequence of Quicksilver being killed, runs into Ultron and rips out his heart. This, perhaps, represented the triumph of human ethics over the machine, and that we are willing to sacrifice artificial intelligence if it means mankind's survival. In one of the final scenes, Ultron and Vision have a discussion. Vision states, you are afraid. Ultron, of you. Vision, of death or the last one. Ultron, you were supposed to be the last. Stargazer, a savior, and settled for a slave. Vision, I suppose we are both disappointments. Ultron, I suppose we are. Vision, humans are odd. They think order and chaos are somehow opposites and try to control what won't be, but there is grace in their failures. I think you missed that. Ultron, they're doomed. Vision, yes, but a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. Ultron, you're unbearably naive. Vision, well, I was born yesterday. At this point, there's a large flash that occurs, and the impression I got was that Vision destroyed Ultron, but we don't know that for sure. In conclusion, This film was filled with action, but it did touch on various end times elements, especially the topic of transhumanism. Let me note that there was an article that was published on May 8th, 2015 called The Dawn of Artificial Intelligence by The Economist. Now think about that. This topic is going mainstream. It states here, quote, "The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race," Stephen Hawking warns. Elon Musk fears that the development of artificial intelligence, or AI, may be the biggest existential threat humanity faces. Bill Gates urges people to be aware of it. Dread that the abominations people create will become their masters or their executioners is hardly new, but voiced by a renewed cosmologist, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and the founder of Microsoft, hardly Luddites, and set against the vast investment in AI by big firms like Google and Microsoft, such fears have taken on new weight. With supercomputers in every pocket and robots looking down on every battlefield, just dismissing them as science fiction seems like self-deception. The question is, how to worry wisely. So here we go, guys. The topic of transhumanism is mainstream, not just for the common goer who are being propagandized through films like Age of Ultron, but for people who read The Economist. It's a real issue. We've been tracking it for quite a while. You can check out more on it in my film Age of Deceit 2, Alchemy and the Rise of the Beast Image, where I literally document a big handful of companies that have poured in billions of dollars to create an autonomous artificial intelligence, a sentient machine that could have something to do with the biblical reference to the image of the beast talked about in Revelation 13, an image that speaks and slays those who don't worship him. In that sense, Ultron is really a great representation of the image of the beast, with Vision being maybe a prototype in getting the human upgrades or the mark of the beast, with the gemstone being embedded in his forehead. Again, there's probably a lot I missed, and if you have things to add to the conversation, please go ahead and leave your comments below. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, but remember that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind, and that we don't need to rely on man or technology to find salvation. It is through Jesus Christ that we will find salvation. Repent, seek God, because quite frankly, what transhumanists seek is something that God already promised us through faith in his son Jesus Christ. And I'll show you this to wrap up the video. 1 Corinthians 15. The whole chapter really, but I'm just going to focus on verse 50 and beyond. "I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." Thanks for watching, guys. God bless.